Hey guys, Zach here, and today I want to talk to you about feeding your fish. Now, when we're talking about feeding fish, it is super important to remember that, just like people, what you're going to feed your fish is going to determine a piece of your fish's health, and there are a multitude of different factors that you do want to consider before picking a specific food for any type of fish. Now, the first factor that I like to consider when choosing a fish food for any type of fish is going to be the type of fish they are. And by type of fish, I mean if they are a herbivore, omnivore, or carnivore fish. And this is super important for determining the type of food that you're going to give your fish. Now, understanding the type of fish that you do have, whether it is a carnivore, herbivore, or omnivore, is super important for a couple different reasons. The first is that depending on what type of fish, it's going to dictate which type of food that you do buy. If you have a fish that is a carnivore, you don't want to feed it something like algae wafers because it's probably just not going to touch those. It's going to see them and think, okay, what are these? Are they food? No, because they're algae. That's not what I eat. I eat mostly meat because I am a carnivore, so maybe I eat like insects. So those algae wafers are going to go to waste and they're just going to sit on the bottom of your tank and accumulate. Now, the second reason is that even if this carnivore fish does pick away at the algae wafers, it's not going to get the proper nutritional value that it does need, and it most likely can't even digest the algae as it is a carnivore, so its internal digestive system is different than a herbivore fish, which can digest algae. So it's super important to understand the type of fish that you do have so that you can get the proper food for them and they are able to get the proper nutritional value that they do need from that food. Now, the second factor that I like to take into account when deciding what type of food to feed my fish is going to be what water column they generally inhabit. Now, generally speaking, fish are usually divided into three water columns, either the surface dwellers, your mid dwellers, or your bottom dwellers. Easy enough to explain, your surface dwellers tend to stay near the surface of the water, right at the top of the tank. Your mid dwellers are in that middle water column. They like to swim around a bunch, and they might even go up and down. And then your bottom dwellers are generally the fish that stay close to the bottom or even on the substrate. And understanding these habits is super important when deciding your food for your fish. Now, understanding which water column your fish likes to inhabit is super important when picking a food. If you decide that you're going to feed your fish, let's say, pellets, it's important to understand if you're going to get sinking pellets or floating pellets. If you have a bottom dweller, you don't want to have floating pellets because your fish is down here and the food is way up here. And that can be quite stressful for a fish if it needs to go out of its comfortable water column that it normally inhabits to get food. The same thing being said, if I have fish that like to inhabit the top and be close to the surface, I'm not going to feed them a bunch of sinking pellets, which are going to end up on the bottom, which they might not even look at, and is just going to accumulate in the bottom and cause problems for me later on. Now, with all of this being said, it is super important to remember that if you do decide to start up something like a community tank, you might have to have a couple different varieties of food. Because in a community tank, you should have fish that occupy each of the water columns. So you are probably going to have to feed different types of food to effectively satisfy your fish. You're going to have some fish that occupy that surface layer and they're going to probably want floating food. And the fish in the mid column might come up and eat at the surface with other surface dwelling fish, but the fish at the bottom aren't going to want to come up. So it's important that you do maybe have some sinking food so it can get down to them and they can eat, and you're making sure that all of the fish in the tank are fed. And that is perfectly fine to make sure you have a variety of food if you do decide to go with a community tank. Another factor that I like to consider when choosing the type of food that I am going to feed is going to be the frequency at which I am going to be feeding the fish in the tank. Now, frequency is going to often actually be determined by the type of food that I do decide to feed the tank. If I know I want to feed the tank live food more often, then I'm probably not going to feed the tank as often. If I'm feeding them like brine shrimp, I'm probably not going to be feeding them that every single day. I'm going to probably space it out every couple of days. Only a couple times a week is the tank actually going to be getting fed because it does have that more nutrient-dense food. Whereas if I decide to go with like a flake, then I'm probably going to be feeding the fish much more often, and it might come down to every day or every other day. So the type of food does actually help to determine the frequency at which you are going to feed the fish. Another factor that goes into deciding how frequently I do feed a tank is going to be the fish's size. Generally speaking, larger fish can go a little bit longer without eating, and smaller fish need to eat a little bit more frequently. If I have a tank with a bunch of fry in it, I'm going to be constantly having food in there because they do need those nutrients available to them at all times as they are growing. But let's say the adults, the parents of the fry, they don't need to eat as often. They're already developed. They've got the nutrients that they need, and I might feed them once a day or every other day, and they're going to be perfectly happy. Now, with all of these factors considered, the type of fish you have, be it a herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore, the water column that the fish occupies, as well as the frequency that you are going to feed the tank, you can decide on a type of food that you do want to feed the fish, and having a mixed variety of food is perfectly fine. I feed a combination of pellets, flakes, as well as some frozen food and some live food, so they do have a very mixed diet, and I have found that this is actually the best, and it gives them the best range of nutrients as well as a varied diet that does keep them healthy. Now, something else to consider when we are talking about feeding your fish that you should be able to see is going to be overfeeding and what it actually looks like. Now, there are a couple of signs that you can look out for and make yourself aware if you are overfeeding your tank or not. The first sign to look out for is if you come back after feeding a tank and there is uneaten food left over. So you put some food in the tank, you walk away from the tank, come back 10 minutes later, and there's a bunch of food still in the tank that hasn't been touched and it's just floating there. It means you're feeding too much and you're going to be wasting food, and it's going to be overfeeding the tank, which can lead to buildups in nitrates and in ammonia. The second sign to look for is if algae suddenly starts to grow in your tank. Let's say you feed your tank and you come back 10 minutes later, there's no uneaten food left over that you can see, but then a couple of days go by and you see that algae start to suddenly spike in your tank. That can be a sign that you are overfeeding, because algae is only going to start to grow if there's an excess of light or if there's an excess of nutrients in the tank. And if you've got your light really dialed in, that means you might have too much nutrient in the tank, which can mean that you are overfeeding and that food is getting trapped somewhere, and the algae is able to feed off of the nutrients that the food is providing to it. Now, the third sign to look out for is going to be cloudy water. If there's too much particulate in the water, it can lead to a cloudy tank, and it is a sign that you might be overfeeding and putting too much nutrient into the water column, giving it that murky, cloudy appearance. Something that generally goes with that is going to be the fourth sign, which is going to be a foul smell from your tank. If there's a buildup in nitrates or in ammonia, you can start to get a bad smell coming from a tank, and it's a sign that you might be overfeeding your tank. So those are the signs to look out for that will tell you if you are overfeeding your tank or not. So that is everything for this video. Thank you guys so much for making it this far. If you found this video helpful or if you have enjoyed, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.